Whoa, 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 whoa. Don't click off. I know this seems weird. This is a CG channel comparing Octane and Redshift. But before we do that, I kind of want to make this quick analogy because I know some of you might not want to watch the whole video. It's very long. I understand that. But I thought this would kind of hammer everything in, no pun intended, on what I think about these two engines. This is Octane. It's simple, to the point. You don't have to have a lot to get the job done, and it's easy, just like that, and you got your tool working. This is Redshift. Unlike Octane, it requires more steps to get your job set up. In this case, hammering or screwing two things together. For Redshift, or this tool, you need electricity, you gotta set it up. It takes a little bit longer to figure out how to use it. You have to change bits out for certain situations. It can be a little bit of a mess if all you need to do is just hammer two things quickly together. However, unlike with Octane, this allows you to get stuff done a lot faster once it's set up properly. So you might be saying, which one is for me? Well, you'll figure that out in this video right after a word from our sponsor. Do you want a fun, structured curriculum without watching countless hours of non-narrated YouTube videos? Do you want to look cool like this guy? Well, you're in luck. For real, guys, if you want to, check out the link below. I have some pretty cool, fun classes on Octane and Redshift. I really made these classes because I saw a lack of affordable, structured educational content that I really wish I would have had access to when I first started. So check out the links below. Okay, so let's touch on the most important thing to consider first, and that is workflow and kind of like how fast you can move through the programs and workflow speed. And really, I have a little list right here. I'm going to do a broad overview and then give you a specific example of how this would apply. So first off, without a doubt, it is quicker to move around in Octane. It's a lot faster of a program to move through. You have to do less stuff. You have to change less things. You get beautiful photorealistic results with very minimal effort put into it. But that's not to say that it is perfect in a lot of ways. Redshift, you have to do a little bit more changing of settings, and I'm not just talking about changing the GI. People said that in the past, like, just flip the GI and it's the exact same as Octane. No, it's really not. For example, volume workflows, I'm going to touch on that. It's a little bit more convoluted. Caustics are a pain in the ass to do in Redshift. They look really nice, but they're pain to get set up. So, and those are just two examples. This kind of is just throughout the program. A lot of times there's not a huge difference, like inside the node editor, you won't see a big difference between the two. However, there is a difference, so I want to touch on that real quick using volumes as an example. You'll see this division between the two come up a lot, but I thought this one really kind of just separated them in a good way, and it shows you how Redshift gives you more control over everything, but you got to set more stuff up to get it done. So let's jump in. So to create a volume in Octane, all you really need to do is fire up Octane, select VBD, get the VBD volume path in there, and then you have a volume. It's working perfectly after you scale it up to your scene size. However, in Redshift, it's a little bit of a different story. So first, I'm going to drop in a light, open up the Redshift render viewer, and then we're going to pull in a volume object after we get our light in the scene. And really, this is interesting. So we'll just pull in our volume object and import the VBD file like we did last time. However, nothing's happening. That's because we have to create a volume material. This is the first step we have to take. After we create a volume material, we have to then go ahead and map the density in. We have to tell it what channel to look, and then we got to go to the light, tell the light, contribute to the volume right there. Now I'm going to scale it back up, and you see we have our volume. However, it doesn't look that good. It looks kind of horrible. This does not look like a nice fluffy cloud. It looks like a jaggedy Lego brick. So we're going to actually have to go in and remap the density of this volume and then change the absorption and scattering of everything. You can see that this is just a little bit more convoluted of a process. I'm not saying it's bad. It actually gives you a lot more control and it's a lot more clear, but you have to take more steps to get a nice looking volume in Redshift. Y'all like my gamer headsets right here? God, that's not even funny. Okay, so now that we've talked about workflow, let's talk a little bit about speed, the speed of each engine. And this, oh my gosh, this starts so many fights in and of itself. I want to be very, very clear here. Both engines are very fast out of the box, but overall, if you were just to tell me in one sentence, like which one's faster, Redshift is faster. Without a doubt, Redshift is faster. but you have to optimize it and you have to know what to do. Okay, so I want to start off by just quickly dispelling some myths right off the bat so I don't start a war in the comment section. These engines are both incredibly fast and can be incredibly fast in their own rights in different situations. I want to explain why that is. And this is coming from my personal past experience with projects that I've done. Of course, this may differ on your experience in your projects, but for me, this is what I have come to find. So first, we just have this basic Cornell type box right here, and these are just used to simulate or kind of to test the reality, like how realistically you're rendering an image or how realistically you're tracing an image. So right now we have our Octane set on path tracing, and I'll show you right here. One of the big shortcomings with the GI modes in Octane is if you have an indoor scene like this one, it's partially indoor. If we go to something like direct lighting and we go to GI none, you can immediately see this is very, very not good. We do not have enough light bounces or anything. And this is here for flexibility, because sometimes you really can't tell the difference between GI none and path tracing depending on how your scene and lighting is set up. So what we can do is we can go to GI ambient occlusion. We're getting a little bit more lighting, but not enough. And really the big differences between these have to do with color bleeding and light bouncing. So see GI none, GI ambient occlusion, still a little bit better, but not enough. And then GI diffuse, which arguably looks very, very good. And this is something that I want to mention real quick. You can see in the top right here. I'm not sure if this is coming through on the YouTube compression or not, but we're already building up some hot pixels, which is just something I noticed with Octane. It is way more sensitive to hot pixels. To fix that, you want to play with your hot pixel remover on your camera imager or your filter size right here. But I'm just saying that right off the bat because I do notice a big difference between hot pixels between these two engines. So GI diffuse right there, but we can go a step further and go to path tracing. And PMC, this really is kind of only for certain niche cases, and I do not really recommend using it that much, but is the most accurate kernel there is. So let's go back to path tracing, which you can't really see a difference. You can see there's a big bounce difference between, and I'll just compare store render buffer right here, and then I'll go back to direct lighting. You can see that we're bouncing a lot more light with path tracing. We have a lot more color bleed happening. So essentially, like what is color bleed? Well, the reason that these walls are red and green is so you can see when light bounces off something, it kind of will bounce that color. So like the rays hit here, then they bounce and they reflect the green, and you can see that green is much more represented here in the walls, and so is the red versus the GI diffuse direct lighting. And if we were to do GI none, well, you can see right there, just like that. So let's go back to path tracing. Awesome. We'll just leave it in right there, and let's talk about the limitations of path tracing. So first off, a lot of people argue Octane is biased or Octane is unbiased. It's really not when you're using it, because you'll probably use a GI clamp, so you're automatically biasing your rays just like that. I just clamped my GI. That's a bias move. Also, I can change the light sampling rate, and that's a bias move as well. So just don't argue about if it's biased or unbiased, because that's not a huge deal. Even in Octane, you have biased options, and it's great. I am not faulting the engine for this at all. This flexibility is really what we need as artists, because sometimes you just got to get the render out. You got to get it to your client, and there's not enough time to path trace a scene. So direct lighting scene will do the justice. But I just wanted to touch on that real quick. Like, we still have stuff here. I do want to mention that Octane in path tracing will calculate caustics, and in Redshift you have to set that up, and it's a little bit of pain. We'll talk on that when we get into it, but let's go back to path tracing right there. So yeah, it's great. We have a lot going on here, but still there's more ways we can optimize. I'm not going to touch all the optimization ways. There's some great settings here under, let's go to camera imager, enable it. Okay, so we have the AI upsampler, which can be very, very powerful. I have had some issues with it in the past, but in certain circumstances, it really shines, usually with high contrast scenes, or if you have an edge between like a specular material, and that's really bright, and then like a translucent material, and then you have like a dark background behind it. It has some issues with it, but other than that, it's amazing. Can be an amazing tool. So is the AI denoiser. These are great. I'm not going to really consider these in the kind of speed comparison. I mean, like you can consider them yourself, I guess. They're great, and I love using them, but they sometimes are clutch, but not always. And they are definitely way better than Redshift's options for denoising. And I don't even think Redshift has an upsampler yet. So what I really wanted to touch on here is this adaptive sampling. So I'm going to turn that on, and then we get this little noise right here. So we set a threshold, a noise threshold of 0.03, and then, or 0.2. We can just take it down to 0 because that's what I like to do with this one. And then once we hit a minimum samples of 256, which is going to take a while, so I'm just going to clamp that down to 5, which you wouldn't want to do in a render because usually you see like enough of the image hasn't really been calculated yet. So like right here, there's some green and you're going to get some weird edges and stuff. You can see how these edges are still rough. You want to crank that up higher, but I just want to demonstrate real quick. You can see it once it hit that threshold, which usually would be like 256. So if we turn that to 256, that's a good one to have. And then group pixels, I like to do none also, unless I'm really in a hurry, because you can get some jagged edges with that, and that is very unpleasant. But let's do this little ball right here, render region it. So you can see it starts turning green. Okay, it turned green, so it hit the threshold. Octane was like, okay, there's not enough. I've hit the noise threshold. Okay, so now this hit the noise threshold. So now it's quit rendering that part of the image and is now focusing on the other parts of the image. This is a biased move. This is a Redshift move. Just letting y'all know this. I don't care if they're biased or unbiased. I just want y'all to know, yes, this is a biased move. You're biasing your samples to a certain area, but that's fine. That's not a bad thing. That's actually an optimization. So what I really want to say is this engine in Redshift is built on adaptive sampling, and then Octane kind of just has it as a feature. So what you'll see when we go to Redshift is it's way more smoothly integrated, and we'll talk about that. But I just wanted to point that out. The adaptive sampling, it is offered in Octane, and I do use it a lot, but it can be sometimes not the best, depending on your scene, what's going on, especially with fog volumes. I find it will just like render certain parts of fog volumes, and then it will stop rendering other parts that really needed some more focus on. And just because there was a black background, it quit rendering that volume. So yes, Octane has an adaptive sampler. It's amazing, and it's very fast. It's a very fast engine. I'm not knocking it at all for that, but let's talk a little bit about Redshift and why it's probably in most cases, especially if you're working with more geometry, going to be a faster engine. Okay, so let's talk about Redshift. So for Redshift, you go to your settings right here, you click right here, you go to GI, and let's talk about the different GI modes. So our primary GI engine, Redshift has two engines, primary GI and secondary GI. And this is where the strength of Redshift comes in, because it allows us to control the GI rays and also isolate samples for certain objects or materials, or even calculations like reflections. And we'll be talking about that going in depth. But first, I just wanted to point this out. The primary GI engine. You can see this is much like our Octane like default GI that they give us. It's like not very accurate. Sometimes though, you can't notice a difference between this and brute force, and I'll show you what brute force does right here. So when I brute force a GI, there we go. Look at all of what we're getting. We're getting that color bleed. We're getting our reflections filled in. We're getting our shadows filled in. Look, we have the green color right there. And then we have a secondary GI engine, and that would be, and we could do an irradiance point cloud, which is basically firing a bunch of rays, and then it fills up the scene. So I'll do that for you real quick. And this won't come into effect until we bucket render. So if we bucket render right here, there we go. So you see it's firing all the rays, and then it's going to do the brute force GI over that, and that's just kind of helping this engine. It's kind of blending them together, I don't know how, and getting it a little bit brighter and just a little bit more filled in. And this irradiance point cloud is not as accurate as brute force, and you notice I might have not mentioned photon map. That's not important. You don't really want to use that one. It is slower, and it's older method. These two are the primary ones. A good combination is brute force and irradiance, but if you want to be very accurate, you could do brute force. And then you can see the buckets take a little bit longer, but still pretty fast. And our image is pretty clean so far for what we have going on. And there it goes. And each bucket is a separate GPU. So I only have one GPU on right now. So there we go. It's bucket rendering and it's cleaned up the image. So that's our GI. We have direct control over it. Also, a lot of times you'll get noise from your GI, and this allows you to clean that up and control it. So like, let's zoom in right here and let's just go into windowed mode so we can just see one little area. And let's focus on this little ball right here. So let's go the GI raise down to 1. Look at all that noise. So instead of just cranking up the overall samples like you would have to do in Octane, in Redshift, you're able to just optimize a certain part. So we can go to our number raise and go to 5, 12, like that. And now look, we cleaned it up pretty good. And we can even jump up to 1024 if we wanted to. And that made a slight difference, but now we're getting diminishing returns on this. So that's kind of the point I'm trying to make here, guys, is both the engines are really fast, but Redshift allows you to jump in and kind of change some stuff to make it faster for your particular scene versus Octane, where you have basically one overall slider, your sample rate, and then you can do some slight optimizations, like you can actually control the amount of sampling each light's doing. But Redshift's engine, as far as optimization goes, gives you so much more. We'll talk about that right now. So to see this method, what I'm about to show you, you need to be in bucket mode for this. So we want to click show samples. So if you might notice this unified sampling right here, this is basically a advanced version of the adaptive sampling we just covered. So we have this samples min and samples max right here. Let's click show samples. Okay, so we get this grayscale image. Basically, this is Redshift saying, okay, I'm going to fire more samples where I have this adaptive error threshold of 0.01. I'm going to fire samples until I get to 16 or until I reach this adaptive threshold error. So if I change this 16 up to 128, you'll see we get more samples being fired because it thinks Redshift is an intelligent engine. It's gonna go. Okay, so it's like I'm firing 64 samples. So like this would be 64 right here, what it's seeing. But it's like, okay, but still I haven't hit this 0.01, so I'm gonna go to a 128, and then it has to stop at 128 because we said, hey, this is your max samples. You cannot go past that. If we go up to something like 256. Like that, you can see we're starting to get diminishing returns. And then if we were to turn this show samples off, you can see we get this really noise-free render. But this is not the best way to do it in Redshift. Even this is an optimization in and of itself, but still not the best way to do it. You might notice this adaptive error threshold is in the same as Octane 2. So this is kind of just a render engine thing in general, but it's built like really deep into the Redshift engine. So let's go to sampling. Another thing you do, sample filter. That's a lot like the Octane blur. Basically just kind of will anti-alias your image. So if we go to like filter size of 4, there we go, and we zoom in, you can see now this is with a filter size of 4. Let's go back to like 1. We'll do 1 right here so I can show you. Oh, you see how this is much sharper? This does blur, and you can see we have a lot more noise. This does blur your image, so you don't want to go too high with it. You can see it kind of looks like it's out of focus, but sometimes it comes in very clutch when you got to get a render out. You can crank that up to like, I want to go past 4, and I do like using the triangle method for whatever reason. I find that is the best one. So this still is not the best way to optimize Redshift, even though it is built into the unified sampling. Really, what you want to do is go to your sample overrides. You can see I'm already overriding 2 things, and that's reflection and light. Basically, what this is doing is when Redshift is rendering, it's going to go, okay, so let's start rendering. Fire the rays. Fire a minimum of 4 rays no matter what, and a maximum of 32 rays, and then stop if you reach a adaptive error threshold of 0.01. But with sample overrides, Redshift is going to go, okay, it's going to check here first, and it's going to, okay, reflection, 128 rays, fire 128 rays for reflections. Okay, light, 128 rays, fire 128 rays for light. And then it's going to go over here and say, okay, since I checked those two, we're not going to override refraction. We're not going to override ambient occlusion. We're not going to override volume. We're not going to override single scattering. And we're not going to override subsurface multi-scattering, which is a different subsurface scattering. It's going to go up here to the unified sampling and go, okay, here's the samples min, here's the samples max. Fire at least 4 rays. It's going to fire those 4 rays and then check adaptive error threshold of 0.01. So is there basically noise at this threshold? Yes, there is. And I'll show you all this. So it's going to go, okay, yes, there is. Fire again. Fire, let's say 8. And it's going to keep firing and firing until it either reaches this number or this maximum amount of samples. So the higher this number goes, the less noise we'll have, but also the longer our renders will take, as that is. So really what this allows us to do is kind of override this. So let's say you're getting a lot of noise in your image and it's coming from your light. Just crank your light up to 512. And instead of having to turn this number up to 512, you can take this back down to something like 64 or even lower, depending on your scene. And then let's turn off the show samples right here. And you get a really noiseless render. Same thing with reflection. So if we click this right here, let's see if we have any reflection noise. I'm going to turn off reflection for y'all just to show all this in action. No, nothing there. Nothing there. Okay, so I know we have, it might not even be necessary to do reflection in this scene. I know we have some light noise, so I'm going to turn off light. Okay, and then I'm going to go ahead and turn this back to 16. Okay, so we have quite a bit of noise in our shadows right here. So what I'm going to do to optimize Redshift, instead of going up here to this and automatically going this, and I'm going to just change this to 32 right off the bat because usually 16 is a little too low. I'm going to go to the light right here and I'm just going to check, okay, check the check mark, and then let's see where that bucket is. And now it is rendering, and this can really be seen in the shadows right here. So let me take this light down the shadows. Okay, there we go. Perfect example. Hopefully this is coming through on the YouTube compression. I'm going to zoom in a lot. So right now we are samples maxing 30 to our light. If we take this down to 16, it's going to get way worse. We're samples maxing 16 our light. However, we can override this light samples right here. So if we go right here, click override samples, and then I'm going to go to replace, and then let's do a maximum samples of 512. And you can see how much it cleaned that up. So this is why Redshift is so fast, because we can go in and select what our scene has in it and what we need to increase. Of course, this requires a little bit of more intelligence about how the engine works and a little bit more time, but it is in a lot of cases a good trade-off, especially for productions with multiple teams that can have people go in and like specifically go in and optimize every scene before they send them off for final render. This is one of the reasons why Redshift is so popular, or is becoming so popular on productions, because it allows you to mess with these back-end settings and really dive deep into some things. Of course, not everything is perfect with this engine. I have noticed there's a lot of noise for some reason when we're working with alphas. When you're like alphaing out a material, for some reason, I don't know, I got a lot of noise doing that one time. It was a lot of GI noise, and I don't know if it wasn't reading the alpha correctly, if I needed to clamp it more, but yeah. But let's talk about one of the shortcomings where Octane really does perform better than Redshift, and that is denoising. So there's several options. There's Altus single pass, Altus dual pass, and then optics. These Altus singles and Altus dual, I hate them so much. I sometimes do use Altus single because in some circumstances it performs better than optics, but I never use optics dual. Sometimes it takes longer to denoise the image than it did to render it. So I'm like, why don't I just increase the samples at that point? But optics is pretty fast. So to show that in action, here we go. You can see it's not that great though. It just basically blurred our image. Let's go right here and let's turn it off. So we'll go to none. And then let's just make a lot of noise. So let's go to sample overrides and turn off lights. So let's say you didn't properly optimize this scene, and then let's clamp this down to like 6. So let's say you didn't properly optimize the scene and you were like, I'm going to denoise it. So let's go right here and let's bucket render this, because you're not going to see this unless you bucket render. Okay, so we have this very noisy shadow. If you go to optics right there, you'll see what it does to it. It basically just blurred our whole floor. And this method of doing this looks horrible in animations currently. Of course, they're always working on updating this, guys. Everything I'm saying is current to like today's upload date. Look at the video. Maybe you're watching this in the future. But this is just horrible. It's I very, very rarely use it unless I'm desperate and I'm getting some like random GI noise that I can't fix. So I would not recommend you do too much denoising. For stills, it's perfectly fine, but for kind of like, also I find it performs very, very poorly with volumes in many circumstances. So I stay away from it. And this is kind of just like, I just wanted to touch on this stuff real quick so y'all understand. I know there's like a lot of, oh my gosh, there's so many arguments online about this. To answer your question, yes. They are both very fast, and out of the box, they perform very similarly. If maybe not even Octane is a little bit faster out of the box, especially with those direct lighting modes. But you can optimize Redshift so much more to make it faster than Octane in your specific scene. So if you were to take two identical scenes and compare them, and they had a bunch of geometry, a bunch of different stuff going on, a bunch of reflections, you could go into Redshift and dial those in. But in Octane, you really don't have any more options than to do some like denoising, and then maybe you'll be lucky and use some adaptive sampling and the AI upscaling. If all those three are going on together, by the way, it can be very messy, so I don't always recommend that, but just letting you know. And then you'll just have to end up cranking up your sample rates. Versus in Redshift, you can go in and just select what do you want, what part of the image, what are you trying to optimize, and then turn that up. Also, I wanted to make a quick point that this is also built into the materials. So there's this refraction transmission right here. We can even turn up the samples of that. I just wanted to quickly touch on that. So I wanted to show y'all just like a quick comparison of why it's this way. So this is with Octane's adaptive sampling, and you can see it's kind of more of just a filter thrown at the end. It's the engine guessing at what it thinks needs to quit being rendered and what it thinks it can focus on. This is a bias technique, so you're biasing the engine. It's great that it's a feature, but you can get some edges. There's some edge cases like with this one where you get some weird edges and just some artifacts along fog volumes. I've noticed a lot. It's not always there, and it's not super noticeable unless you're pixel peeping, but in some cases it's unusable because it will create these crazy like weird artifacts. In this case, I was able to get away with it because I rendered it at 4K, but if I was at a lower resolution, those artifacts might be a little bit more noticeable. So with this one, I'm probably going to step on a lot of toes and a lot of people off, but this is just my personal experience with using the two engines. And right off the bat, I'm going to remind you again, you can get the exact same results if you know what you're doing in each one. If you know, if you're a good enough artist or you're experienced enough, that's kind of a better word to say, because really all it is kind of experience. If you're experienced with the engine, you can get the exact same look out of both of them. However, from my personal experience with the two, I prefer the look or the quality that Octane delivers. And it's really not quality. I do believe in a lot of situations, for some reason, the lighting just looks a little bit nicer inside of Octane. I'm not sure if it's how they're handling their color mapping or how they're handling their tone mapping with exposure. I just like it more. Also, I like those film responses that they give you in the kind of options under the camera. So I really, personally, I just like the look of Octane more. And if you were to show me two pictures and say this one is from Octane, this one's from Redshift, I might not even be able to tell the difference. In fact, I probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference. Just when working with the two programs, I find it easier to get a nice look out of Octane than Redshift. That's not to say that if you're a Redshift artist, your art is going to look worse than an Octane artist. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm just saying, for me, it's easier to find a nice look in Octane. And part of that's probably because I started in Octane. It was my first render engine. I have actually spent more time in Redshift up to this point. because I've been doing so much production oriented projects in it. But I just wanted to say that real quick. It's not, guys. There's like, seriously, I didn't even want to put this in the chapters, but I thought it was important to tell you I personally prefer Octane's look more slightly, and I might not even be able to tell the difference if you showed me them. But just with working with the engines, that's what I have come to find for myself. So yeah, I mean, it at the end of the day, guys, like I said, it matters more about you and you as an artist, not so much kind of your tools that you're using. You can do it whatever way you want, but just know, I mean, it really comes up to you at the end of the day.